Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are a group largely of historians, not geographers, it seems, because some people have not yet found their way back here. But I'm sure that the crowd will be expanding dramatically and probably pretty quickly. In any case, it's about time for us to begin the last, but I think you will see by no means the least of the sessions for this conference. And I'm Jerry Bentley from University of Hawaii. I have the great honor and privilege to serve as the chair for this session on new scholarship on science, ideas, and philosophy. And we will proceed in the order that the panelists appear in the program. And each will take 20 minutes or possibly a little more than 20 minutes for a presentation, followed by some discussion. The first speaker in this session, if anybody here needs no introduction, it is George Saliba.
I was supposed to actually go way beyond golden age and decline. I have already 10, 15 years ago have gone way beyond and redefined golden age. Now I will, at the time when I did it, I didn't have enough abilities to put them all in the book. But because again, if you want to publish things with illustrations, it becomes considerably more expensive. So you have to be very parsimonious with them. But with the PowerPoint, you can do whatever you want. And I would like to show you exactly what I meant by the golden age of Islamic astronomy. And here I speak of astronomy on the level of planetary theories and on the level of very sophisticated mathematics. And I will speak about a period mainly after the 12th century, which is the standard age when everybody tells me that the age of decline has started. With, of course, the poor Ghazali. He gets murdered every time anybody speaks about this subject. So I hope that I will be able to at least show that the effect, if there had been any negative effects, they definitely did not come from Ghazali. The speaker earlier, Mr. Arkley, I think, mentioned something in passing at the very end, that if we really have to look for something, this code word called colonialism, we should really reawaken it and discuss it a little bit more. Now, what I was told to do is to speak about the novelties and the modern original ideas of astronomy after the Ghazali period. And I will start by this quotation from the age of decline, just at the beginning of it, meaning towards the beginning of the 11th century. I have this citation from a text written by an Andalusian. And my purpose, by the way, of picking these texts is to spread them across so that you don't think that there was one bright guy and that's it, that's the end, you know? Like the people think that this was the last flame and whatever it is. I'm going to spread them geographically, chronologically, so that to show you that there was a very vital activity going on during this period. This text, unfortunately, we don't know the author, but we do know from inside the text, and everybody, by the way, it's a good recommendation, read the text. Then inside, you will be able to find things, even though the name of the author might not be on the flyleaf as you see it over there. It's a very poorly preserved manuscript. We know he was a friend of Az-Zarqiyal, who lived in Spain about the year 1070. And we know from him, inside the text, he tells us, in one of those famous sentences, he says, وَقَدْ وَجَدَ الْمُتَأَخِّرُونَ, the English translation at the bottom for those who want to read English, أشياء كثيرة لم يجدها المتقدمون سنذكرها في كتاب الاستدراك. Here you have, in the middle of the 11th century or so, an astronomer who is very cognizant of the fact that he is doing something completely new, something that had not been mentioned before, and he promises that he will give this text and he will produce all of this material in Kitab al-Istidrak. The text has not been found, so if anybody of you is fondling through manuscripts in Istanbul, usually all the manuscripts are in Istanbul and they are sitting on them, and it is a struggle to get manuscripts out of Istanbul. I should say this in public, especially in a Turkish audience like this. Help us. I mean, get these manuscripts out so that we can read them. I'm sure one of you is going to run into a book called Kitab al-Istidrak. Somewhere you are going to find it, and hopefully you send me a copy as soon as you find it so that we can find what is inside it. But at least we know from the declaration of the author that he is doing something completely new. In the East, somebody like Ibn al-Haytham, living in Cairo, who had all sorts of problems with the classical Greek tradition, and he writes a full book specifically called Ash-Shukuk ala Batlamyus. What else novelty do you want? This is a guy telling you from the very beginning that this tradition I inherited from the Greek is nonsense, and we would need to look at it completely afresh. And here is the reasons why. It's not because they are Greeks, but because they make scientific mistakes. He says these impossible mistakes are not to be tolerated, and hence we should start a whole new science afresh. And what a breath of fresh air. This is happening just at the beginning or the middle of the 11th century. What is he talking about is this following phenomena, that in the Greek tradition, we inherited a geometric configuration proposed originally by Aristotle on how the planets move around us. And in the diagram that you have it over here, Aristotle tells us that for an observer sitting here on the Earth, you can still hear me if I turn my face away. Oh, that's the beauty of technology. Now he says the planet actually is stuck on a small sphere that is rotating this fashion. This whole small sphere is carried within this light blue sphere, and this light blue sphere should, by Aristotle's definition, run uniformly in place so that everything is uniform motion. And then for us here on the Earth, we will see this planet looping around, which is the phenomena that we see up in the skies. Except Ptolemy, the interpreter of Aristotle, tells us that this light blue sphere does not run on an axis that goes through the Earth, does not run on an axis that goes through its center, but on an axis called the equant, which is off top. And he still says that it needs to run in place at uniform speed on an axis that doesn't go through its center. I got a friend of mine, through the generosity of the Mr. Al-Hassani, who's here. He actually got a man to do the animations for me so that you can actually see what happens. And you've all seen this basketball player who can actually spin that thing on the finger as long as the finger is going through the axis. See what happens when it doesn't? You see? Watch it again. As the minute the finger moves away, the whole Aristotelian universe collapses. Now, astronomers who read this description of Ptolemy, they said this is impossible. There is no physical sphere that can actually do that. Hence, we are not talking about a real world. The first thing to do is junk this astronomy and let us begin a fresh astronomy. That's where novelty begins, by the way. It's when you say, what I've inherited is not good enough, now I want to think of something else. In response to all of that, these doubts, cosmological failings, and a series of astronomers, all living, I'm reading it for you there, during the so-called age of decline, produced what I have termed elsewhere a veritable golden age of Islamic astronomy. I'll only give you a few examples of them, as I said, to spread them geographically and spread them chronologically, that it is not an individual Averroes, he revived philosophy, oops, and then philosophy died. This kind of paradigm, we have to get out of it, and now I spread them with Mu'ayyad al-Din al-Urdi of Damascus, died 1266, Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, 1274, Qutb al-Din al-Shirazi, 1311, Ibn al-Shatir, 1375, Ala al-Din al-Qujri, 1474, and Shams al-Din al-Khafri, 15. You want me to go on? That's where the limit of my research has stopped. Not that the sources do not have more. I need more time to read the sources and to be able to report on them. But that's where I have stopped for the time being, and again to give you just as wide a spread as I can. With the text of Mu'ayyad al-Din al-Urdi, here again the novelties, how do you look for them? In the middle of the text, when the author tells you, what you have learned so far about astronomy is not sufficient. Now I need to introduce a new concept, and hence a new mathematical theorem that was not known before in the Greek tradition. So he knows that he needs to resort to new tools, new mathematical tools to resolve these mathematical problems. And here is the theorem. He gives it right in the middle of the text, and you can see it really illustrated, and he plugs it in, and you should be able to tell that now he is actually talking about something new. The next, his friend by the name of Nasiruddin al-Tusi, he was his employer, by the way. He was also reading the text of the Ptolemy, and when he reached this stage in the text of Ptolemy, he says, أقول هذا كلام خارج عن الصناعة. In polite conversation, he was saying, this kind of speech is utter nonsense. And he is speaking about the most important text of the Greek tradition. And he says, in order to actually save Ptolemy from himself, I can propose a new theorem, and he proposes it right there on the margin, so that we see again new mathematics being plugged in to be able to solve problems that the Greeks could not solve. About 10 years later, he realized that this theorem is not trivial, that it is worth actually developing further, because you can use it in all sorts of places. And here is the Arabic text where he develops it, and he actually proves it right in here and gives us the mathematical proof. Well, about 200-300 years later, this damn thing appears here in a Latin text, but this time is written by Copernicus. Copernicus, for those who don't know, died 1543. So this novelty, when it comes into the Islamic sources, is highly appreciated in the Renaissance, and unfortunately not by modern Arabs and Muslims who actually never read this material. The theorem that Tusi actually puts it in is a very simple theorem. He needed to produce linear motion, as you see this red dot that goes up and down, linear motion as a result of two circular motions. This has all sorts of other implications, mechanical implications, geometrical implications, and so on, but it's very useful for astronomical research. And Tusi was the one who actually puts this new theorem as a proposal up front, and he proves it, as we have seen. And when you notice the proof, it actually, I didn't notice it, but it was the late Willy Hartner of Germany who noticed the proof. In the Arabic text and in the Latin text of Copernicus, he noticed that where the Arabic has alif, the Latin text has A. Where the Arabic has ba, the Latin text has B. Where the Arabic has jim, the Latin has G. Where the Arabic has dal, the Latin has D. Where Arabic has ha, the Latin has A. Says, wait a minute, you are copying down even the geometric points. If you were originally writing your own proposal and you write triangle ABC, you put ABC wherever you want. Why are you committed to doing it exactly in the same positions as Tusi had done it about 200 years before, which means that he must have been looking at a diagram as he was actually developing this. We have other reasons to know that he was looking at diagrams, and times he didn't understand the diagrams. In one instance, for example, here the zain in Arabic is transliterated as F in the Latin, because for those of us who know the Arabic script, the relationship between zain and fa is very, very close, and it's easy to confuse the two. There comes also a Ptolemaic problem, which is related specifically to the planetary model of Mercury. That is a very difficult model, and the way Ptolemy proposed it is in this fashion. Here, I don't have any intentions of turning you into mathematicians or astronomers. So give up, relax, and so on. All I want you to look is the visual difference. This is the model as Ptolemy tells us the planet Mercury moves around, and we are sitting here on the Earth, and it is the observer O. But this is the way Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi tells us that this planet actually should move. So see only the complexity of it to see how sophisticated this discussion comes, and that is Qutb ad-Din, we said, who dies in 1311. Thanks to Edward Kennedy, the late Edward Kennedy, who actually managed to translate this work of Qutb ad-Din al-Shirazi into modern vector spaces so that you can see how sophisticated the mathematics that Qutb ad-Din was thinking of. Okay? This usually does not come from a period of age of decline. It usually comes from a period of people who have their brains on their shoulders and they know how to use them, and hence they produce this kind of material. Then comes the movements of the moon, which is one of the smallest things that runs around us, and it is very close to us. We shouldn't worry about it too much, except that Ptolemy noticed that this moon, which is carried on a little epicycle here, when this sphere is at the time of conjunction, meaning the moon is close to the sun where you can't see it, or when it is a full moon, he noticed that at the time of full moon, the maximum variation between where the moon is supposed to be and where the moon is actually placed is only a variation of 5 degrees or so. But when the moon is quarter moon, that is 1 week old, the variation between where the moon is supposed to be, meaning you compute its mean mass and motion, and where it is actually is, the variation here is about 7 degrees and a half. So if you have the same object, on one place you see it as 5 degrees, on another place you see it at 7 degrees, what's the technique of accounting for that? Ptolemy had this genius idea. He concocted those mechanisms here to bring the whole epicycle closer to the Earth so that it would look bigger, which is very nice. You see, if I put my hand very close to my face, I don't see the wall, because my hand becomes bigger than the wall. So anything that comes close will become bigger. So Ptolemy satisfied himself with this solution, because then he could account for this variation between 5 degrees and 7.5 degrees. So that will take care of it. Except he forgot something. When you bring something close, it will have to look bigger also in its own size. The size of the moon itself, never mind the carrier of the moon itself has to also look twice as big. And this, I drew it to scale. That is a moon at 1/4, according to Ptolemy's computations, and that is the moon at full moon. So somebody like Ibn Shatir in Damascus says, "Lam yura kadhalik." I have never seen the moon look twice as big when it is at quarter moon. Therefore, we need new mathematics. And that's what he proposes. He says, I can account for all the variations that Ptolemy is worried about, but then I can arrange the spheres that carry the moon in such a fashion that here it will be maximum 5 degrees, but when I bring them to 90 degrees, I will mount them in this fashion so that this angle will become 7.5 degrees. So this way, I will account for the longitude of the moon, I will account for the observations, but at the same time, the size of the moon will stay as put and as we normally see it. And hence, he solves this problem elegantly. So who comes along? 1543. None but Mr. Copernicus. He does exactly the same thing. Look at it. Sphere for sphere, angle for angle, exactly the same solution that here he can account for 7.5, here he gets it for 5 degrees. So you're entitled to ask, did he know about the works of Ibn Shatir before him? And this kind of mathematics, it is not an accidental mathematics. It is involved. As you see, you have to construct it and account for it and so on. Then also, Ibn Shatir was not happy with the Mercury model that we saw earlier. So what does he do? He proposes a completely new model of Mercury here, and it is this model in particular that also Copernicus takes, and it is in this model that he makes a mistake. He tells us that the orbit of Mercury in here is bigger than the orbit of Mercury here, because he didn't pay attention to the distance of the object. Look at it. I also drew it to scale so that you can understand it. A smaller circle here, which is brought closer to the observer, will have an angle which is in the blue as you see it there. A larger circle that Copernicus thought is the real size of when it is farther away from the observer, will have a smaller angle. The red angle is smaller than the blue as you see them over there. So he made this confusion, and he says that the orbit of Mercury, when it is about 90 degrees away from the apogee, is at its largest. And hence, Sverdlov, who edited the work of Copernicus, says he really doesn't know how the model works. So is this possible that he invented this model when he doesn't know how it works? 2, is it possible that he invented a model that was already invented by Ibn Shatir, where Ibn Shatir knew how it works and told us in great detail on how it works, and in the case of Copernicus, it didn't. Then comes along Ala ad-Din al-Qushri, who says, I'm not satisfied with all of this because there is another way of doing it and accounting for the movement of Mercury, and this is the constructions I apologize for the little dotty figures, but what can I tell you? So this is again a model by Ala ad-Din al-Qushji, who died. This is Ptolemy here. Ala ad-Din is about 1474, 1481, and he introduces again a new mathematical model. I have 2 more slides. Oh no, I have 5 minutes. I can do it. Then comes a man by the name of Shams ad-Din al-Khafri, who is almost totally unknown to people. I have published already about 4 or 5 articles on him in the 1990s and continue to do that. And he has written, among the many other things that he has, mainly commentaries on Nasiruddin al-Tusi. But the last book that he wrote, listen to the title, Hal ma la yanhal, literally saying the solution of all the problems that have passed before and could not be solved. You want more originality? This is a man who died about 1550, just about the same time when Copernicus was dead. And what does he do? He discovers all of a sudden that all of those models that we have seen before are basically mathematical descriptions of the physical phenomena that we see out there. And who says if I can put the vectors, connect them left, right, I can also connect them right, left. And in other words, I can create new mathematics to account for those. And he begins to show off how much he can do it. Look what he says. He takes the first proposal on how to solve it. This is the kind of construction for the Mercury model. Then he says, you can also do it this way. Then he says, you can also do it this way. And wajhun akhar is the same one that Ala ad-Din al-Qushji has done. So he says, all of them are 4 different ways about speaking about the same physical phenomenon. And then he says, to sum them up and to prove that they are all identical, he gives you the combination of all of them. And in the article I published on this, I can show you the mathematical proof that they are all predicting exactly the same motion that we do. So what is this man doing in the middle of the 16th century? He is saying that stop thinking of mathematics as a science, which is a very modern phenomenon, by the way. Now, the mathematicians don't like to be called scientists at all. Actually, they'd like to be called artists or all sorts of other things, except scientists. And then he says, you should know exactly the power of mathematics. It has limitations. It is not a physical science. So stop thinking of the ideal mathematical solution. There is no such thing, because phenomena can be described in English. In fact, he doesn't say that, but I say. The same phenomena can be described in poetry, in prose, in English, in French, or in mathematics. Mathematics is just another language. And now I would call this the epitome of originality. A man who really knew what is the function of mathematics in the language of science and how you can go around to describe the physical phenomena correctly with varying mathematics. And I thank you very much. I think this is the last. Thank you.
We have a presentation on a very different topic, but this also has some big implications. Yesterday, I mentioned that Ahmed al-Rahman has promised to bust the myth of Al-Ghazali, and I think he is going to show us some of that this afternoon.
Well, we'll see how much I can bust, but let me just begin by thanking our great patron. What I'm going to talk about is the reception history of Avicenna between the 11th and 14th century, and I'm looking into biography as a source for this history. And so please indulge me in my reading of the paper. The history of post-Avicennan Arabic philosophy, with few exceptions, has received little scholarly attention and remains to this day largely virgin territory. This neglect is particularly true of its development during the Seljuqid, Ayyubid dynasties through the Mongol Timurid Empire, roughly dating from Avicenna's death in 1037 to the rise of the Safavids in 1501. A major reason for this neglect in scholarship is that many of the works of this period, the majority of which are still in manuscript form, unedited, perhaps the ones that you were referring to, were...
The Turks to send manuscripts.
Yes, I ditto that. Unedited, were written in the style of paraphrases, abridgments, commentaries, super commentaries, and super glosses. As such, they have been deemed by Montgomery Watt and others as unoriginal compositions unworthy of the modern scholar's attention. A lot of this, I think, has to do with how manuscripts were perceived in the Latin tradition. In the Latin tradition, there's glosses and these kinds of things are generally disregarded. Now there's been a kind of revival, even in the Latin tradition, of taking these kinds of genres seriously. In considering the vast number of extant legal, theological, and philosophical works from this area, some scholars have even concluded that this time between Avicenna and the Safavid period was indeed also a golden age of Arabic Muslim scholarship and intellectual history. Stated differently, there has been a persistent paradigm in modern Islamic studies whose basic contention is that after Ghazali, who died 1111, Ghazali's critique and censure of philosophy until Napoleon's invasion in Egypt in 1798, and Ghazali's adoption of occasionalist theory of causation, so-called because it sees every event as an occasion upon which God directly acts in the world, Muslims, particularly Sunnis, ceased to study philosophy and other forms of theology, including that of the Mu'tazilites, the earliest school of Islamic rationalism, while so what I'll be arguing is that, again, largely based on the biographical tradition, I'll be arguing against this form of historiography. A key facet of post-Avicennan philosophy is its reception history. Namely, what was the intellectual, educational context wherein Avicenna's works were taught, studied, and by whom? Were these teachings and who was teaching these works and studying them? Were they philosophers? Were they jurists? Were they theologians? And which Avicennan texts were studied and commented on? And of the latter, which became standard works within the medieval intellectual history, particularly the Madrasa? Answers to these and related questions, I think, are sought in the mainly Arabic, Persian, and the Turkish biographical tradition. This literary tradition, with its various genres extending from the early centuries of Islam to the modern period, include the lives of the scientists and physicians. You also have the biographical dictionaries of the Sunni legal guilds, of the Shiites, biographical dictionaries as well, which extend really way up until the present. What follows then is an assessment of these genres for Muslim intellectual history between the 11th and 15th century, their role in the making of Muslim guild identity. I think that's very important in terms of how guilds identified themselves. And what I'll also do is I'll look at some, in reading biography, it's not sort of straight facts, you know, so-and-so was born here. There are often stories that are told, and you have to begin looking at the literary tropes or topoi for the points that these legal schools are trying to make. While the lives of the philosophers genre of biography often provides disconnected anecdotal reports, akhbar, about the philosophers and their works, the overarching, though not necessarily explicit literary narrative is the transmission of knowledge, ilm, or of the ancient sciences, ulum al-awa'il, from their Greek origin and later within the Muslim tradition. This transmission narrative is primarily represented through the student-teacher relationship, the foci of which is the studied text. And what is often argued in the biographical tradition, its uninterrupted transmission to the next generation of philosophers. So this idea of students, the notion of an isnad is central to how these, of what works within the transmission of philosophy. This genre emphasizes the authenticity and thus the authority of a particular text through its manuscript transmission from teacher to student. This narrative also is often expressed through certain apparatus and topoi associated with the science of hadith, ulum al-hadith, but specifically with the ancillary sciences of the lives of the hadith transmitters, which addresses through biography their moral and immoral character, and thus their authority in conveying the sayings and reports associated with Muhammad and his companions. Moreover, it was the use of the chains of transmitters, the isnad, and later certificates of authorization or license to transmit or teach a work, ijazas, which largely defined the science of hadith and which later came to define the science of philosophy. So what you have is the establishment of these mechanisms of transmission which are completely taken over within the philosophical and the study of the ancient sciences. The richest source for the history of post-Avicennan philosophy is the biographical dictionaries of the Hanafi and Shafi'i school. In his book, The Balance of Truth, Haji Khalifa, who died in 1657, he writes about the reception history of, quote, the books of the ancient peoples translated into Arabic, unquote. He says, in every age, men of sound natural judgment and straight mind have not failed to read and study the books of the ancients. In every age, the works of scholars who have devoted themselves to philosophy and sacred law have been widely known and esteemed and sought after. The great divines, and I won't read all of the names he mentions, he begins with Ghazali, goes through Fakhruddin al-Razi, who dies in 1210, and then ends with Jurjani in 1413, says, actually Dawani in 1501, says that these have been sought after by these scholars, and they did not restrict themselves to the study of one branch of the science. So this notion that you had fixed genres and scholars did not go beyond them is clearly that problem is, I think, really dismissed by not only the textual evidence, but of course what Haji Khalifa says, who wrote the Kashf al-Zunun. Now, this quote illustrates that after the 11th century, the classical delineation between the various classes of scholars, namely the jurists, theologians, grammarians, exegetists, philosophers, etc., their respective disciplines and the genres associated with them, and the divide between the ancient and Arab sciences began to break down. Okay, and I would say that at least in the 8th and 9th century, you really did have a kind of division, particularly when these guilds were coming to be. They defined themselves very clearly. This process began to break down between the various genres, and it appears to have started at least with Avicenna's own philosophical works, in which he took up questions of theology, namely revelation, wahi, prophecy, nubuwwah, resurrection. These were traditionally the domain of theology, but now Avicenna began to write about them and use the terminology, of course, that was associated with those fields. This trend of blurring the genres continued most notably with Fakhruddin al-Razi, whose own writings combine discussions of jurisprudence, theology, logic, and philosophy. Not all of these works were, as is often assumed, critiques of Avicennan philosophy, but many of them served as evidence in their long commentary tradition as textbooks in the medieval and in some cases modern madrasa curricula. So I think that, one way that we know that there was intellectual activity is the record that the madrasa tradition has left behind in the form of commentaries, glosses, etc. A major theme or preoccupation of the biographies of Muslim jurists is the identity of the Islamic legal guild, or madhab. That is, to define the contours of the guild with an emphasis on fealty to its putative creed and to its scholastic legal methodology, usul al-fiqh. The biographers of a school often indirectly addressed their biographical works to the following questions. What constituted affiliation to the guild? What are the scholastic, legal, and theological bases for this affiliation, and on what basis can affiliation to the guild be scrutinized or disqualified? These and related questions were central to how, over time, the genre of the lives of the jurists defined a legal guild against competing ones and against other disciplines, including theology and philosophy. Although these questions were not always explicit in the introductions to these works, they were often made explicit in the course of the individual biographies. So you get a lot of this material just by reading the biographies. And while George Mekdisi's thesis that there was a strict division between the foreign sciences and the Arab sciences, and he largely gets this from the endowment documents, the waqf, and that notion, I think, has to be revised. It has led to a sense of, I think, stagnation in looking at the madrasa tradition. And let's see. His thesis that philosophy was excluded from the madrasa tradition will have to be, as I said, revised. This is now, there is now mounting textual evidence, mainly from the medieval Arabic biographical tradition, that by the 12th century, the study of Avicennan logic and philosophy became widespread in Shafi'i circles, including those directly involved with the Madrasa tradition. I'll give some examples of this. Moreover, the scholastic chasm between the ancient sciences and those of the Arabs does not appear to have been as great as is often assumed. I've got a lot of evidence for this, I promise you. While much of the details of the history and interdependence of these two broad categories of the sciences awaits further research, it may be argued that in the way that Asharite theology was slowly naturalized within or came to be strongly associated with the Shafi'i school, Avicennan philosophy underwent a similar process of naturalization within Shafi'ism. Hanafism and more broadly, Hanafism and more broadly the Arab sciences. Nevertheless, what appears to be clear is that all of the Sunni legal schools, the one which had the greatest hand in the transmission of Avicenna's writings was the Shafi'i madhab, primarily through the vehicle of the madrasa. And here are some examples of falsafa in the madrasa. A Shafi'i judge who was well known for his works on philosophy and medicine is Afdal al-Din al-Khunaji. He died in 1248. He was appointed as a teacher in the Salihiyya Madrasa in Cairo by its founder, Ayyub al-Malik al-Salih II, who ruled from 1240 to 1249, who also appointed him as the administrative judge of Egypt, Qadha Misr. I mean, this was a very, very important position, obviously. Khunaji wrote two popular, commented upon epitomes of Avicenna's logic, the propositions and an epitome of the logic, al-Mujaz fil Mantiq. In one of the medical biographical dictionaries, Ibn Abi Usaybi'ah in the Uyun al-Anba writes that Khunaji distinguished himself, quote, in both philosophy and in Sharia. So that he says that, and Khunaji taught Sharia or fiqh at the Salihiyya Madrasa, but apparently did not publish a specific work addressing these subjects. Nevertheless, the Shafi'i Biographical Dictionary recognizes him for his tenure as the highest-ranking Shafi'i judge in Egypt and as a teacher in the Salihiyya Madrasa, as well as for his authority in logic and the ancient sciences. Another example of the teaching of the ancient sciences in the Madrasa involves Athir al-Din al-Abhari, who upon arriving in Erbil lived and taught at Dar al-Hadith. The first Dar al-Hadith was established in Damascus by Malik Saleh, who died in 1181, for the sole purpose of studying Hadith. Again, there were these endowment documents that stipulated what you could study there. Other Hadith, Dar al-Hadith, other institutes of Hadith were later established in Syria, Iraq, Egypt, Palestine, and other places. At the Dar al-Hadith in Erbil, the Shafi'i biographer Ibn Khalikan says that he studied under Abhari the science of disputed questions, a branch of the principles of jurisprudence connected with the science of dialectics. The relevance of logic and dialectics to the study and practice of disputation theory to the principles of jurisprudence was well established as a subject of study in the 13th century. So this was one way that you had the intermingling of logic and the training of jurists. Nevertheless, after reporting that he studied ilm al-khilaf, disputation, with Abhari, Ibn Khalikan tells the following poignant story about another teacher of his, the well-known hadith specialist, Taqi ad-Din ibn al-Salah, who died in 1244, wrote a very important hadith work, who studied logic with the famed Quranic and biblical exegete, the mathematician Kamal ad-Din ibn Yunus, who dies in 1244. Ibn Khalikan says, while I was in Mosul, a certain jurist related to me that Ibn Salah obtained permission from Kamal ad-Din to study privately under his direction a part of the logic. Ibn Salah went to him regularly for some time, but he was unable to understand anything of it. So Kamal ad-Din said to him, in my opinion, O jurist, ya faqih, that you had better renounce the study of this art of logic. Ibn Salah asked for what reason, our master. He received this answer. Quote, the public and Nas look upon you as a good and pious man, and consider those who labor in this art as holding pernicious opinions on religious matters. Fasad al-i'tiqad. Your continuing to study logic is therefore as if you risk losing their esteem without even acquiring any knowledge of this art. The jurist Ibn Salah took his advice and gave up the study of logic. He was later to issue a fatwa against the study of logic, too, just to solidify things. Whatever its veracity, this anecdote reflects a certain contempt that the traditionist camp held for the study of logic and, in general, philosophy. The literary purpose of this anecdote appears to be an attempt on the part of Ibn Khalikan or his informant to forfend any possible traditionist criticism of studying with Abhari and Ibn Salah, and of Ibn Salah for even venturing or thinking about the study of logic with Kamal ad-Din ibn Yunus. Ibn Salah, as I said, later issued this fatwa against its study. Now, I'm going to look at just some of the sort of source criticism, and we'll get into the issue of Ghazali here. In his stylized autobiography, or Apologia for the Study of Philosophy, Deliverance from Error, the Asharite theologian Muhammad al-Ghazali writes that only after studying the science of kalam, and while still burdened with a teaching load of 300 students in the Nizamiya madrasa in Baghdad, did he embark on a 3-year study of Avicenna and philosophy. I mean, this is absurd. I mean, anyone who has taught a course that has 300 students knows you cannot study Avicenna's philosophy while doing that. I try, but anyway. Let's see here. And he says that he only studied Al-Farabi and Avicenna during this period, that Ghazali studied philosophy for only 3 years prior to writing his Incoherence of the Philosophers, as I mentioned, is doubtful. It appears rather that he began studying philosophy in Nishapur while he was still a student of the Asharite theologian Ad-Juwayni, who died in 1085, whose own use of Avicennan philosophical terminology is well documented. And continued to study philosophy, Ghazali that is, throughout his tenure as a teacher in the Nizamiya Madrasa, which ended in, that tenure ended in 1095. In other works, Ghazali studied philosophy for at least 20 years prior to writing the Incoherence and the Intentions of the Philosophers. Therefore, Ghazali's statement that he studied philosophy for only 3 years was an apology for his would-be traditionist Shafi'i critics, many of whom many of whom would later attack him for studying philosophy in the first place. For example, Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, who died in 1148, a student of Ghazali, says of him, I mean, this is his student, he says, our Shaykh Abu Hamid entered deeply into the bellies of the falasifa, and when he wanted to get out, he couldn't. This opposition in traditionist Shafi'i and Hanafi circles to the study of philosophy and to philosophy itself took the literary form of the topos of accusing those who studied it of exhibiting, quote, Shiite tendencies, or of, as well as the notion of corrupting, quote, the Arab sciences with the ancient ones. So the mixing. I mean, this clearly went on and is acknowledged. This topoi features prominently in the biographical and legal works. While there were many Shafi'is engaged in the study of philosophy, clearly not all of them were accepted as legitimate members of their legal guild. Many of them were accused in the biographical literature of exhibiting often unspecified Shi'i tendencies or of being outright Shi'is, and or of neglecting their obligatory prayers, tark as-salat. There's actually an interesting story, I think it was about Abhari. His students wanted to know whether he was performing his prayers and doing ablution, so they marked his foot while he was sleeping, and they came back 3 days later. Clearly, it was still there, so that was their proof that he wasn't doing ablution or praying. While there were many Shafi'is engaged in the study, while the purpose of these topoi appears to have been to dissuade fellow Shafi'is from studying philosophy, an implication it has had on both the medieval and modern historiography of Islamic philosophy is an exaggerated sense that after Ghazali's censure of philosophy, those studying it were predominantly Shi'is. We have this notion, right, that Sunnis left philosophy and the Shias picked it up. Anyway, this is problematic. And I would say that I've looked at the reception of Shafi'i's work, and in terms of philosophy and logic, there really is not very much of a reception history. There's a bit of it in the Ottoman period, where there's a work that compares his refutation of the philosophers with that of Averroes's refutation. But there isn't a long commentary tradition. And one way that you find out things were important and read and I think in the case of Ghazali with philosophy, and you have to look at the commentary tradition, who wrote what and what glosses, and Ghazali is out of this picture. But as far as his legal and other works, yes, he has a reception history. Let's see. In general, those Shafi'is who were rejected or whose Sunni reputation was impugned by their own biographical tradition, the Twelver biographical tradition was all too eager to claim many of them as having been all along true Shi'is. And while there were many Twelver Shi'i philosophers after the 12th century, the majority of those, at least until the 16th century, and again, you have to stop somewhere, right? I haven't gone beyond that. Engaged in the study of Avicennan philosophy and logic, in and out of the madrasa, they were the Shafi'is that did this. In addition to the above literary tropes, the above literary tropes appear to disconnect the religious authority of the legal, theological, and Quranic exegetical works from those of the Shafi'is who were known as logicians. So many of these figures wrote works on law, but they wanted to discredit their religious works because of that. For example, the Shafi'i biographer Esnawi, in his entry on Bedruddin at-Tustari, who died in 1335, refers to him, quote, as our sheikh, and praised him for being, quote, the master of his time in the two principles, namely jurisprudence and theology, as well as logic and philosophy. However, Esnawi then goes on to harshly criticize him for his abiding interest in playing chess, and as well as being a Rafid, that is a Shiite who rejects the caliphate of the first three caliphs, and that he also neglected his regular prayers. So while praising him, he also goes on to discredit him using these three tropes. While this vituperation of chess playing as, quote, empty and wrong-headed amusement, lahu batil, and the neglect of prayers are common themes in the biographical literature, the charge of rafth, namely the rejection of the rightly guided caliphs, is more serious and tantamount to excommunicating Tustari from the Sunni community, Ahl Sunnah wa Jama'ah, or as Esnawi calls them, the proponents of true knowledge, Ahl al-Ilm. Following Ash'ari's lead, the Hanafi Ismail Basha al-Baghdadi, died in 1912, was even more explicit in his censure of Tustari, explicitly stating that he converted to or took up Shi'ism, kana yatashayya'u, thus leaving little doubt for his audience about Tustari's alleged Rafidi creed. This slight against Tustari may also have been an indirect attack by the Hanafi Baghdadi on the Shafi'i school. So it goes back to that question I was asking earlier. However, Tustari was not claimed as a Shi'i by the Twelver Shiite biographical tradition. I mean, nowhere have I found him to be a Shi'i in any of the sources. A major reason for this appears to be Tustari's clear fealty to Shafi'ism as demonstrated through his Shafi'i juridical works. I mean, that's what he wrote about. He wrote about Shafi'i law. But yet these accusations are there, including his super commentaries on a number of works by the celebrated Shafi'i jurist and Quranic exegete Baylawi. Having spent his life, and I'm almost done here, having spent his life as a Shafi'i philosopher, theologian, and jurist, there is little doubt or evidence to think that Tustari would have converted to Shi'ism in any of its forms. This disparaging jarh that you find in the hadith works of Tustari's Shafi'i bona fide is not unlike that encountered in works addressing the character of hadith transmitters, that is the Jarh wa-Ta'dil works, wherein their authority, the transmitters, in linking a tradition back to Muhammad is repudiated or upheld. Therefore, this attempt to cast aspersions on Tustari Shafi'ism on account of, quote, his lack of religiosity, as another biographer put it, is further indication of some of the difficulties in reading biography. In conclusion, what I have tried to demonstrate here is that the writing of Muslim intellectual history, especially after the 11th century, is largely dependent on an analysis and reading of Arabic and Persian and Turkish religious biographical religious and secular biographical works, and that an understanding of these sources is based on documenting how the former, particularly through the apparatus of hadith criticism, influenced the latter. That is, the religious works, biographical works influencing the secular ones. That the traditional division of the sciences between the Arab and the ancient ones, علوم العرب والعلوم الأوائل, which existed in large part during the 9th and 10th century, began to be blurred after Avicenna, leading to the study of logic in the Madrasa tradition, and hence, I think, the revision of Maqdisi. Thus, some of the secondary scholarship, which argued based mainly on Waqf documents, should be reconsidered. I'll stop there.
Yes. Our last panelist, Nabil Matar, has a double assignment today. He not only will make his own presentation, but as some people have already heard, only 2 or 3 weeks ago, he was the organizer of a program very similar to this one, parallel, in fact, to this one. So we'll hear something in the way of a report or reflections on that previous project, as well as his own presentation.
All right, thank you so much. As all of us, we all start by thanking Jamil and Susan, and I would particularly do that and to tell them there is life after the conference, because we went through that, as Jerry has mentioned, on the 24th, 25th, and 26th of February, and you know, there's a whole team involved in it, and after that, as I say, there is life to be resumed. Again, we're all very, very grateful to the National Endowment because it made these opportunities possible for us, for George Mason, and 2 other institutions. I gather 4 were granted, NEH awards to conduct their projects out of, I think, 46 applicants. So we're very, very fortunate to have been one of those. We got wind of the announcement rather a bit late, so we kind of met very quickly at the University in Minnesota, and at the time, Giancarlo was still with us at the time before he traveled around and deserted us, and we were just kind of, what kind of project should we put forward? And Bill Beeman, who's the chair of the anthropology department, was just kind of reflecting, and he said he has a friend of his who's actually putting together a play, a one-man kind of, well, in a way, one-man play of kind of a text that was written sometime in the medieval period about a guy on an island, and Hayman Yaqdan. And it so happened that the summer before that, I had found a manuscript of the first Arabic translation of Robinson Crusoe, which obviously, as you may know, depended on Hay. So I was actually working on Hayman Yaqdan, Robinson Crusoe, and this first Arabic translation in 1810 by an Orientalist, Burckhardt, a Swiss-English Orientalist. And so, basically that was it. We started saying, okay, we start with Hayman Yaqdan, and we're going to end with this play. And that is basically how our idea came for what we called shared cultural spaces, that, basically we're going to see what kind of spaces were shared between Islamic traditions and civilization and the West. And, Hayman Yaqdan is really the first classic in the Arabic tradition. If we understand by classic a text that cuts across linguistic and religious boundaries, it's an amazing text in terms of the journey. It has taken, written somewhere around 1180. A century later, it's kind of revised or revisited in Damascus, and then it reaches Florence by Pico della Mirandola, and then Spain, and then finally Oxford, where it is translated into Latin in 1671. It has a tremendous impact on late Restoration English thought. It's translated 3 times into English in that kind of short period of time, and then it's adopted or taken over by Daniel Defoe, the famous author of the famous Robinson Crusoe, who uses that. And then, the text is reappropriated somewhere in the middle of the 18th century, again by an English writer who turns Hayman Yaqdan into a Catholic monk on an island near India, until, as I say, we end, or at least I ended, with Burckhardt's interpretation or translation of of Ibn Tufayl slash Robinson Crusoe. So we thought we would start with Robinson Crusoe, with the Hayy bin Yaqdan, this amazing text of an individual without a history, without a geography, without anything. I mean, he just pops out of the mud, and yet his impact was so dramatic. And indeed, in the Arabic tradition, the text is so frequently remembered, even down to the Muqarri in the 17th century. He remembers Hayy bin Yaqdan. He mentions it by name. So it had tremendous influence. And I think it is because, it creates this hero who has no limits anywhere. I mean, who has no connections, who has no belonging. And so you can read him the way you want, whether you read him as a Quranic man, as a Renaissance man, as a Protestant man, as an English man, as a Catholic man, as an Arab man. In all respects, each kind of civilization, each language, and each of its traditions, again, because Judaism was appropriate also in the 14th century, each will turn him into the way that they wanted to view him. So we thought that's a very good start for us, the medieval period, but we also wanted to extend ourselves very much into the modern period as well. So our design was to have kind of every night a performance of that play of Hayy bin Yaqdan, preceded by our lecture. So we started with a keynote address by Wadad Qadi. I'm sure some of you know her, who gave really a very intense and very scholarly and very rich keynote address. And then the following day we had sessions on the medieval background, and then we had a session on science where the wandering scholar George Saliba also kind of illuminated us with his findings. We had 2 sessions on architecture, contemporary architecture, basically mosque architecture in the United States and the use of the mosque. And then, basically the ancient models of mosques, again, starting with the 3 imperial civilizations. We had a wonderful paper by Kathy Asher, our own art historian at the university, on kind of the use of mosques in the Safavid, Mughal, and Ottoman tradition. And then we ended with a session on contemporary media and the way in which contemporary media views or reviews Islam and Muslims. That was very highly attended. It kind of had all the right buttons that people wanted to, push. One on honor killing, presented by Khalid Samman, one on kind of the use of media, and by Al-Qaeda, by the way, by Fawzi Slusi, and then one on kind of contemporary Iranian use of art. So it was kind of very, very interesting session. And then we ended with kind of our final keynote, which was kind of miles apart from Wadad Qadi, and that was my intention. Again, I'm not, if you know him, Anwar Majid. He's very kind of he's quite an activist and a writer. And so we wanted this really very, very broad spectrum, starting from the medieval period, Wadad dealing with Al-Fahrist of Ibn Nadim, and ending with Anwar in the very, very contemporary and the kind of a very intense presentation on what he called, his title was The Inhumanity of Orthodoxy. I was planning to conclude our meetings with a little final wrap-up, but we were fortunate to have our congressman pay us a visit, Keith Ellison, very, very versatile, very energetic. I mean, I'd never met him. I thought he would be an older man, younger man, really a very, very exciting person. So it was wonderful to have him, and basically we concluded with his final presentation. We had a couple of other activities, and every night, as I said, we had the play performed on campus. They were always filled out. I mean, obviously it was free, but not a single night did we not have it complete, sold out, so to speak, which is why later it was moved into the city itself as well. So we had the play, and the play was really quite a challenge. I read the script, and I was a bit worried how would a play with this kind of limitation come across. But the author is Muhammad Ghafari, and the actor was absolutely incredible, Eddie Orayan, who seems to be well known in the field. I didn't, but really an amazing performance, physical performance of dance and and control of the human body, which were really wonderful. And we had 2 other activities associated with that. One was a visit to our Minnesota Institute of Art, where we had a number of docents taking the groups around various various kind of spots in the museum. It's a huge museum. Various spots in the museum which has kind of a connection with Islamic history, whether in ornamentation, whether in geography, and any other factor that relates to Islamic history. So we had that on Saturday morning. We also had a photograph exhibit of Istanbul in the 1940s. We have a fantastic collection at the Bell Library, and so that was part of our cooperation with them to put up this exhibit, or to continue that exhibit on Istanbul in that particular period. I just want to mention names. I was involved, but really Bill Meeman and Jean Kildee, who's the Director of Religious Studies. I mean, without them, we would not have worked together. And again, we had our absolutely tireless, fantastic person who arranged everything and made it happen, Nahid Khan, who really did a fantastic job in putting everything together. Because we were a large university, we were able to twist the arms of our students to attend, and they did. And many of us asked them to write reports, which they did. But what was really, really heartening is to see, first of all, how much they enjoyed that. I mean, none of them kind of complained. They really enjoyed it. Whichever, they attended panels or the play or whatever they chose to attend. They had to attend 2 activities. I mean, they just loved the whole experience, whether it was the play or the panels. And it was, as I say, something for us academics is where we know what happens at a conference. It was the first time they get to know what happens at the conference. They said, we're amazed at the kind of discourse, debate, disputation. Some people were angry in the audience. So, I mean, it was really, at some points, a very, very rich kind of conversation, which, as I say, the students, I was taken aback because that was something that many of them mentioned, that really we enjoyed seeing what academics do other than kind of, boring us in class. That's what they do out there. And I think that, to me, was very, very heartening that, students became aware of a different dimension of the academic experience. So I guess that was our conference. It was really wonderful. We enjoyed it tremendously. It was a lot of work. So as I tell Jamil again, just relax. You'll have life after that. And it worked very, very well. And again, we reiterate our appreciation to the National Endowment of the Humanities, also many, many departments on campus who were willing to support this project. We're now so excited. We want to try and put up, just within the College of Liberal Arts, to put up a conference every 2 years, given the tremendous support we had from the community in Minneapolis. Minneapolis has a very large, diverse community, part of which is obviously a Muslim community from Bosnia, from Southeast Asia, the Arab world, of course, and so Somalia, of course, is a very large community, I think the largest in the United States. So we really want to be able to work with the community, put up, hopefully, if we can, if we get enough support and funding, a similar conference every 2 years with one motif and see how it continues. Right. Now I get back to something else, which is to quote Baqi, to decline or not to decline. And I think that's why I'm the last one, because I really I think I'm going to open up this issue again, notwithstanding what George and Ahmed have told us, and many of you have, but the issue of decline or not, as I say, is going to be part of my presentation in terms of 2 communities that have not at all been, or one linguistic community that has not at all been touched upon in terms of the kind of the history from below in the early modern period. I mean, I work in the early modern period, so basically from 1550s on, exactly when George stops, till kind of the middle of the 18th century, and that is the Arabic-speaking community of the Ottoman Empire. I'm not going to extend anywhere further. Now, the word Arab raises eyebrows, and if Professor Kafadar was here, he would have actually jumped up, because we've had discussions about that, whether we can use the term Arab Islamic in that period. And I hasten to explain why I use it. I use it as a linguistic community, and I think the reason where we had those discussions I had them with Jamal, was because immediately the ideas of nationalist identity. There are no nationalist identities. These are exclusively linguistic communities, and what I look at are, again, like George is doing with Ahmed, material, most of it is in manuscript, but written in Arabic by Arabs, and I would imagine for Arabs. So there is a whole kind of subculture there, the subaltern, if you want, the linguistic subaltern, that really gets often ignored as we look at the imperial models of, Persia, Safavids, Mughal, and India. There is another kind of a large community, in the same way that we sometimes look at the Jewish community in, let's say, the Ottoman Empire, the Greek community, Greek-speaking community, all are subjects of the Sultan. And so again, when I speak about these Arabs, they're not, as I say, a national identity. They're subjects of the Sultan, with the exception of the Moroccans. Moroccans never came under Ottoman rule. And so, they were different, not only in language, but in custom. In jurisprudence, obviously, North Africa was Maliki to a large extent, and they were very conscious of the difference between them and the Ottoman Turks there. But also, as I say, just habits. I mean, it was fascinating. I was reading a Moroccan traveler, who goes to Istanbul towards the end of the 18th century, and he has no idea what coffee is. And he's kind of surprised. He says, these guys kind of serve coffee. And which is interesting. Coffee doesn't make it into Morocco. It makes it into Europe. It's such, a hot seller in Europe. But he doesn't relate to it at all. And then when he's kind of sailing back, he stops in Algiers, and again he visits the governor, who's Turkish, and he's offered coffee, and he refuses it. I mean, to him, that was just a very unusual thing. So there was a sense of identity difference. I mean, identity obviously is we have to be careful how to use the term, but there was a sense of difference in that respect. Linguistic, jurisprudential, mores-wise, even in terms of ransoming captives. It was repeatedly noted in both English and Arabic sources that when there were negotiations to ransom captives from European captors, that the Turks would, let's say, be paid for like 150 pieces of aid, while the Moors, Arabs, would be paid for by 100 pieces of aid. So there was a difference on various levels. So notwithstanding the fact that the climax of civilizations, Islamic civilizations in this period are in Agra, in Isfahan, in Istanbul, there is a self-understanding that is distinctly Arabic in this period in North Africa as well as into the Eastern Mediterranean. And I emphasize that because this is a period which witnessed an amazing inflow of nearly 500,000 Moriscos from Iberia. And these came, what they knew about Arabic or Islam was problematic, and in a sense, they clung to their identity as Arab because that's how they had been persecuted, as well as being Muslim. So using the Arabic identity became a marker for them that appears very, very repeatedly in their writings. So in short, the Arabic speakers from Meknes to Aleppo saw themselves as Arab. The king of Morocco, the Sultan, ruler, Mullah Ismail writes a letter to Queen Anne in 1714, says, "Nahnu Arabun Ariba." And what is fascinating, which will be the second part of my paper, are these Eastern Christian Arabic writing monks and priests and chronicles who begin to identify as Arabic or belonging to an Arab land exactly at that period. Mikhail Break, who was really very, very famous and well-known chronicle of the middle of the 18th century, middle to later part, begins to use terms like Ardul Arab or Asqa'ul Arab, وَنَحْنُ مِنْ أَسْقَاعِ الْعَرَبِ. Even a very Quranic term like Shu'ub is once, at least, I found one reference to that as Shu'ub al-Arabiya. So, as I say, this begins to evolve. Parameters of my argument, where I'm getting the material is basically writings that I'm looking at from Morocco via Egypt to Bilad al-Sham, both Muslim and Christians. And the reason I'm focusing on these Arabic writers of the kind of Eastern Levant and North Africa is because perhaps these were the only Muslims, maybe that's too big, but they always saw themselves in a vis-a-vis with Europeans. I mean, if you're in North Africa, you are in perhaps more contact with European traders, with European merchants, than with anybody else, except obviously the Ottomans. And, and the same for the Eastern Christians as well. Their contact will be extensive. So I'll be talking about that in later. But the reason for this vis-a-vis is that Maghariba interacted continuously with Spain, with Malta, British commercial and naval fleets in the Mediterranean, and the Eastern Christians traveled variously to Western European regions, chiefly France, Italy, and Russia. So, you know, they could not but see themselves in this kind of vis-a-vis. Now, the issue of decline, which we've all been talking about, I must say that in the Arabic sources I have read, the word inhitat, which, again, as Nelly was saying, you know, it's kind of sort of thing we grow up studying in our kind of high school curriculum, that word I never came across. There is no inhitat, there is no decline. The only time I saw a word was the word taraja, kind of regression. And what I would want to emphasize at this point is, as these writers I'm looking at did actually speak about a kind of regression, they never, ever associated with the kind of debauchery, decadence, disintegration, I mean, all these D words that are associated with decline. They don't see it as a sign of failure, they don't see it, they just realize, you know, they are doing that, they seem to be doing something very impressive, very admirable, we don't. But it's not that we're bad, it's not that we're failing, it's not that, you know, we're kind of, you know, we don't know what's going on. It's just, so there is not that negative side to the element of this self-critique. These people, you know, don't want to feel that they're kind of just sitting there and being comfortable while they actually see what is going on in Malta, in Naples, in Madrid, in London, or in any other of the European cities. And I say they're going there regularly. For instance, you know, we take one writer, Ahmad ibn Qasim, a Morisco who fled into Morocco, travels all the way to Istanbul, and on his way back, and that's somewhere around the early 1620s, picks up a manuscript of the kind of manufacture and the building of artillery. And, you know, he's a Spaniard. I mean, Morisco is a Spaniard. And the text is in Spanish. So, you know, he takes it over and decides to translate it into Arabic. And it's a fascinating text. It survives in many, many manuscripts, which means very, very popular. It has not been edited, unfortunately. There's supposed to be a thesis that in Rabat, which claims to have edited that manuscript. I could not find it. I looked around all over, so anyway. And in this text, it's very interesting. You know, he's saying, you know, he's aware of the crisis in technology, in Sina'a, that's the word he uses. He's aware of that crisis that we don't have. And he's talking about Spain, by the way, which, you know, was seen to be in decline, paradoxically. He sees that as really a great model. So, I mean, when he talks about that, he's aware of this, you know, what's happening there and what we need to have there as well. And so he's aware of that. And he uses the word Europa, Europe. And then, you know, this is, as I say, 1620s. He translates it by 1643. And it's interesting that when he translates it into Arabic, he says, you know, I'm willing to translate other books if there is response to this. In other words, we need to learn other things, and I'm willing to translate them from Spanish or any other European language that can manage if that will help. Somehow there was no encouragement because at least nothing has survived of anything else that he has done. At the same time, as I say, I'm looking at these kind of Arabic speakers in North Africa. I'm looking at the Eastern Christians as well. In 1751, a manuscript which is written most likely, if not definitely, by an Orthodox priest, you know, praises Ahl Europa, again, people of Europe, with specific praise for the Russians. So they are aware of a vis-a-vis, and therefore they're trying to see what they can do to kind of, you know, get closer to the achievements, to the innovations, social developments, infrastructure developments that they don't have at home. So, you know, as we talk about the Moriscos and their descendants, and I'll start with them, you know, these had been arriving throughout the 16th century. Finally, the big expulsion from 1609, 1614. I mean, these are people who come from an empire. They're coming from Spain. They've been active in administration, in military affairs. They've been at sea. I mean, they know the workings of an empire, the dynamics of an empire. So and it's a dynamic, it's an empire, as you know, from South America to, you know, India to the Philippines. So it's a huge empire. And, you know, they had been part of it until they were completely excised. They also know the languages, and that I think is very important. Portuguese, Spanish, lingua franca, Italian. I mean, these are languages that they bring with them, which they put to some use. And, you know, we have texts that have survived by them, whether texts that describe their emotional experience after the expulsion, or by diplomats who were sent to France, to England, to Spain, and who come back and either write a complete account to the Sultan, to the ruler, or write short letters in which they describe how they saw you know, these lands. I just mentioned the names. I mentioned Ahmad ibn Qasim, Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab al-Ghassani in 1690, text I translated, Ahmad ibn Mahdi al-Ghazal, who goes to Spain. And then I think the most interesting, was one who's going to be a chapter in my book on this, is Uthman al-Miknasi, Muhammad ibn Uthman al-Miknasi. This is the only Arabic writer I know of who travels to Spain, who goes to Malta, who goes to Naples, who goes to Sicily, and then who goes on the pilgrimage. So he describes North Africa, he describes Mecca and Medina, back to Jerusalem, off to Istanbul, and then back to Miknas. So I think the only writer around in the 1780s and 1790s who really has a whole span of the kind of the world available to them. Now, ultimately, I would say, vis-a-vis the Ottomans, these writers saw themselves as Arabs. Vis-a-vis the Europeans, they saw themselves as Muslims. So we evaluate these texts in the light of to whom they were being written. If they saw themselves within an Ottoman environment, they're kind of, you know, they're happy what the Ottomans can do to the Europeans, then, you know, we're all Muslim. But if it is kind of, you know, what the Ottomans are doing in North Africa, then we are Arabun Ariba. We are Arabs of the Arabs. And as I say, they're not going to ever claim that, you know, they're weaker or less capable, but there is a motif that runs in their accounts, which is that these Europeans have the dunya and we have the deen. They have the world and its achievements and its innovations and its technologies, but we have the religion. And so whatever they do, that is just kind of, that's temporary. That is, you know, what we have is eternal. And it's very interesting how this mechanism works, because sometimes you'll have a traveler describing for a whole page just amazing things that he had seen, let's say in Madrid or in Sicily. And then at the end of that say, well, it's not worth the wing of a ba'uda, the wing of a mosquito. You know, that it's kind of, who cares about all that, you know. So they're aware, they're kind of impressed, and yet, you know, there is no further mechanism except to say, well, we have the truth of religion. So that's for the Moriscos, and we can talk about them later if you wish to discuss them further. The other group that really now has kind of fascinated, because on the Moriscos I've worked a bit in the past, was the Eastern Christians. And this is kind of material that I discovered as much as I discovered by pure serendipity. I was at the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris, and I was waiting for a microfilm, and I saw a 4-volume catalog of Arabic manuscripts in the bibliothèque. So, you know, okay, take it out with it. And then I realized it's just a rich amount of material written by Eastern Christians. Now, obviously, the French, with their Catholic connections in the East, had been great thieves. I mean, they've stolen everything they could, brought it back and put it in the bibliothèque. So I started requesting these, and they were really quite eye-opening. And so, you know, then I finished with Paris. I went to London. London had quite a bit. I went to Madrid, but Madrid didn't have anything. I mean, they had material before 16th century. They didn't have access to the Eastern Levant, so they didn't have much in that respect. And then the great discovery was when I went to University of Jordan. There is a professor there who has had this mission of collecting microfilms of really every possible Arabic manuscript he can get his hands on. I think he had a royal endowment of sort, which sort of thing we all like to have. But he had, I mean, there is now at the University of Jordan, in the Center for Bilad al-Sham, Markaz Dirasat Bilad al-Sham, and his name is Professor Adnan al-Bakhit. I always praise him because really a very visionary project that he started in the mid-1980s. So now I go every year to Amman because, you can sit in, unfortunately, the equipment aren't very good. The microphones are great, they're all there, but just one ancient microphone machine and everybody's lining up to use it. That's a different story. But the whole point is that you can sit in one room and have manuscripts from Yale, from Chester Petty, from British Library, from Sinai, from American University of Beirut, St. Joseph. I mean, really the major libraries that hold material from the Islamic. And of course, he himself had done work on the Ottoman archives in terms of Jerusalem. So there's this whole other material in Ottoman Turkish that's available there. Again, when I speak about the Eastern Christians, I must emphasize they are subjects of the Sultan. They are Ottoman subjects. So, and I'm going to kind of collapse Orthodox and Catholic, Orthodox/Melkite, just for brevity. All of it, the material is just enormous, and it's all in Arabic. There's some in Syriac, some in Karshuni, but very surprising, and that's a point that fascinated me when Hussein gave his lecture, nothing in Ottoman Turkish, at least nothing I have seen in Ottoman Turkish. And it's kind of interesting. I think it is the period in which these Eastern Christians who had not used the term Arab or Arabi or Ard Arabiya or Lugha Arabiya, begin actually repeatedly to use it. And what I've been doing is kind of making a list of where these allusions appear in order to demonstrate that the beginning of an identity, of a linguistic, cultural identity, again, not a political identity, begins to appear. Now, this is material that's, in my view, very important to study because it tells us how these people understood themselves, what they're saying about themselves rather than what's being said about them by European travelers. And of course, there's a lot by European travelers. Also, that these are texts from the kind of a different social life. It's not the court. The court material has been used, Bruce Masters, Abraham Marcus, Bernard Heiberger, and recently a PhD dissertation by Mazen Tadros. The focus on the court records has been quite rich and quite useful. This is not court, because court, people are angry with each other, they're fighting with each other. These are basically nearly all monks or clergymen or priests, and they're writing within a monastic community, within a religious hierarchy. And therefore, they present to us a very, very different world and a very different insight into the largest, let's not forget that, the largest Christian population outside of Western Europe at the time. And they're all under the Ottomans, from Aleppo, Mosul in Iraq, all the way to Aleppo, to Lebanon, Palestine, North Africa, all the way to Egypt, kind of Western Egypt. What kind of writings did they produce? They're ecclesiastical writings. Accounts about church councils. These people were traveling. They went to Paris, they went to Rome, they went to Moscow to attend church councils. So they become aware of the world around us, the world around them. And councils, ancient and contemporary. So they have a very, very long history of themselves. And the point is that, what was earlier mentioned, that the idea that Eastern Christians didn't have a history of themselves. Well, they actually had a very rich history. There are so many chronicles in which they wrote about themselves and their history from the medieval period. Ibn al-Makin, Ibn al-Tabari, Ibn al-Batriq, was the other, Ibn al-Ibri. All these are writing, they're Christian, Eastern Christians, writing accounts. So there's a legacy that continues with that. So you have this kind of ecclesiastical writing. Then travel writings. The longest travel account about Western Europe, basically about Russia, but about any country outside the Islamic dominion, was written by a priest, Bulus ibn Macarius, in the 1660s about Russia. There's nothing like it in all the Arabic corpus. It's a huge document. Again, unfortunately, not properly edited because there are many manuscripts of it, but that's some. But there's a lot of travel writers because they either went to Russia, they either went to Paris or Rome, or they went, in terms of pilgrimages, not as much to Jerusalem. I see some accounts of Jerusalem, but mainly to Mount Sinai, to St. Catherine's. And they go down there and, they read what is written on the walls, they check on the kind of manuscripts that they have. So you get an impression this is a very thriving community that is going on at that level. There's no science. That is kind of interesting. That particularly, again, with the communities that were interacting with Russia, there wasn't much scientific activity going in Muscovy. But in terms of those interacting with Catholic countries, Italy and France, it's interesting, they don't have anything of what's going on in terms of modern discoveries. The only thing that they have is the calendar. And that is very interesting to see how they identify dates. They will use the Christian calendar, AD. Sometimes they will use the calendar beginning with Adam. Sometimes in the Egyptian accounts, they will use the Coptic calendar beginning with the martyrdom around 270. Always they will use the Hijri calendar. I mean, that is there all the time. And it's interesting because, calendars were very divisive. The English never accepted the Gregorian change until 1751. They thought, these are Catholics. That's the Pope wanting to impose on us. The Russians have not accepted even today. That's why we have Christmas on the 7th of January. It's very interesting. Communities within the Ottoman Empire had no problems in working with the various Christian calendars, but also always, not a single point where they don't use the Hijri calendar. It seems the more kind of established calendar for them. The others obviously are there. All this material really brought me to the issue of dhimma, which is often invoked in the discussion of Ottoman treatment of Eastern Christians. Ahl dhimma, of course, it is second-class citizen. There's no question about that. But on the other hand, these are communities thriving, traveling, writing, worshipping. And they're talking about themselves. They say it's not like outsiders saying it. This is what you can see from their own writings. And at no point do they engage with this problem of the dhimma, or this issue of the dhimma. And they feel very open in terms of what they can do, what they can think, how they can travel. And I'll give one example just to show the difference that occurs between the Ottoman administration and, let's say, the English administration, which I know very, very well. In 1584, the Pope establishes what he calls the Maronite College in Rome. He wanted to bring Maronites from Lebanon to train as priests, teach them Thomas theology, teach them Latin, and they did. Teach them French, teach them Italian, they become multilingual. But then to go back, and he was hoping that these will not only preach to their communities, but also perhaps subvert the status quo, basically anti-Ottoman. And actually, he builds a college in 1584. In 1605, the Druze prince, Fakhreddin, basically begins to exchange letters with the papacy about a possible revolt that could be supported by the papacy. And some, not all, but some of these clerics, these priests, were actually intermediaries in that. So the idea that, there is a purpose to this was clearly there in the minds of the Vatican. What's interesting is that these guys are traveling all the time, in and out. And the list of the priests who come to Rome and go back, it's a very long list, which is interesting. They're getting back under the noses of Ottoman governors. Nobody seems to mess with them. Now, just draw an analogy, same year, with England. If you are an English Catholic and you decided you wanted to serve your parish, you would have to go and train in Douai, in northern France, to become a priest. You would go there surreptitiously, you would return surreptitiously, and you would function as a priest surreptitiously. The famous kind of priest holes in English homes, some of which are still evident today, is where these large mansions that belonged to Catholics had actually holes in the walls where priests would hide in case they were to be apprehended. Now, if these priests were captured, they were drawn, hanged, and quartered as traitors. And yet, these priests from Rome are going back. They're okay. Nothing seems to happen about them. The other issue is the issue that, this material gives a lie to the idea that the Ottomans, again, because these are Ottomans, did not visit Europe. And I'm going to give one example, and this is the text I promised Baki to edit or translate and edit for him. So I'm going to read it very quickly to see if actually he wants it or not. Now, this is a manuscript of 1671. The title is a short letter describing the happy conquest of the glorious king, the Caesar of France, and his conquest of the Flemish kingdom and of numerous major cities in a short time. That's the title of the treatise. In Arabic, with a French translation, the text was written in Aleppo on 1 January 1672 by Francis, son of the Turjuman, posted to Paris. May God protect and forgive it, Paris. The text is in praise of the heroic French, whom the author laments he does not have enough space to describe. I mean, he is just a pro-French voice. The author presents the history of the wars accurately. The French had supported the Flemish, the name he uses for the Dutch, who without that help would have been defeated by the Spaniards. But then the Flemish grew proud and arrogant. I'm just summarizing what he says, arrogant and proud, and because of their wealth and fleets, attacked far and wide. The King of France, unable to endure their subversiveness any longer, joined forces with the King of England and sent him 34 of his magnificent ships, along with 150,000 soldiers, and commanded them to eradicate the Flemish. Meanwhile, the Spanish king supplied the Flemish with all sorts of troops, and he goes on in terms of the wars that were taking place between France and, and the Dutch, and the Flemish at least, which was at the time, partly under Spanish rule. Now, the account is fascinating because it's an accurate description of wars in Western Europe in the early 1670s. Why this account should have been written, who were supposed to be impressed by French might, and what actually motivated the priests to compose it are intriguing questions. The account was obviously intended to discredit the Dutch, who had challenged, quote, all the tribes of the Franks, end of quote. The Dutch were still active in trade in the Ottoman Levant, and both France and England were eager to cut them out of that trade. So showing them in military defeat might serve to turn the local population in Aleppo, the major multinational mart in the empire, against them, against the Dutch. And then it goes on. So, what's this text doing in the archive? And, think about it in terms of saying, would there be, could a Muslim cleric live in Madrid or Rome in 1671, or any other year, and describe the war between, let's say, the Ottomans and the Safavids to his Turkish community in Madrid or Rome, and praise the Ottomans without a single mention, as in this document, of the Pope in Rome or the King in Madrid. So, in conclusion, these two groups recognize the difference between the innovative changes in European technology and administration, art. We have one traveler who is fascinated by opera, falls in love with the opera singer, but just very briefly, and then walks away. The Moriscos were more concerned than the Eastern Christians because the latter were clergy. And again, the fact that they're all clergy means that it's a kind of obviously much more limited world that they had to operate with. Unlike the Moriscos, who were interested in institutions, artillery, kind of all sorts of mechanisms relating to state. The Eastern Christians do not discuss that. And of course, and my two last points in conclusion, basically is, what they seem to have missed is that knowledge, is power, and knowledge is movable, that you can acquire knowledge. And I take an example, for instance, of Fakhreddin, the Lebanese Druze prince who, as I say, revolted, ended up kind of fleeing to Italy, spending around 5 years in Florence, and then visiting actually Malta and Sicily, and then goes back. When he sees, for instance, the printing press, he's just stunned, but he never thinks of taking it back. The same thing, for instance, with a traveler, Abdul Ghani Nabulsi, at the end of the 17th century. He's kind of, in Damascene, from Damascus, goes to visit Palestine, the Holy Land. He was Nabulsi, he was from Nablus, so he's visiting around. And he goes to the Church of the Holy Nativity in Bethlehem. And he's very reverential, very respectful, he really enjoys it. And he walks in, and he is absolutely carried to the seventh heaven when he hears the organ. The monks there were using the organ, and organ obviously donated to them by the French mission. I mean, he just raves about it. He writes a poem about the organ, you know. But again, there is no idea of, well, this is technology, this is knowledge that we can take over. So that's one thing that somehow doesn't appear in this kind of in their interactions and description. The other is kind of that this is a knowledge that really in the Western tradition was a knowledge for not just power, but for empire. And I conclude with a contrast of two writers, one again from Damascus and one from London. Richard Hakluyt wrote perhaps the most important text in the history of English imperialism. His navigations, descriptions of the English people and their navigations, explorations, traffics, etc. I mean, in 1600, England had no empire, had no navy, had no even a monarch who was interested in empire. Queen Elizabeth really had no interest at all in an imperial project. I mean, the farthest that they can do is beat up on the Irish, but that was about all they could think of. But there was nothing. So it's a culture that as yet has nothing to do, unlike the Spaniards, unlike the Portuguese, nothing to do with conquest, with empire. Now take a text by a Muslim, Arab Muslim, Abdul Abbas Ahmad al-Qaramani, and they're writing exactly the same period, around 1600. And he writes, actually again, there are 3 volumes, both have 3 volumes, and he writes the history of the world. And it's full of information, some, like with Hakluyt, some credible, some incredible, an enormous amount of information, أخبار الدول وآثار الأول, you know, history of the dynasties and the monuments of the ancients, but it's purely descriptive, where Hakluyt, as I say, notwithstanding the total absence of any imperial infrastructure or even imperial thinking in England, Hakluyt's text is prescriptive. It becomes really the kind of the groundwork for empire. It's often described as the first imperial epic of England. So would it have helped if Arabic had had a word for empire? Arabic doesn't have a word for empire. Thank you.
This is a fascinating session, and 3 papers totally engaging in very different ways. We have approximately 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more for discussion, and Stephen Dale is eager to jump into the...
I'd ask Professor Salaba a question about the geographic location and institutions that supported astronomy. I feel in the late Abbasid period up to the Mongol invasion, I mean, Greater Khorasan or Khorasan and Central Asia featured such individuals as Al-Biruni, Ibn Sina, Nasruddin Tusi, Omar Khayyam, Al-Ghazali, and so forth. And then in the later period, you have the Mongol Observatory at Maraga, which you referred to, or Tusi was, and then following that, of course, the observatory in Samarkand. So my question really is, to what extent were the individuals you're talking about connected to or located in that area or those institutions?
Okay. You got it. You got it right. Thank you. And I didn't pay him to ask me this extended lecture. I can go on. Believe it or not, almost every single one of the people that I have mentioned, and this is a very small group that I could only share with, almost every single one of them was a religious scholar at the same time and worked within a religious institution. Ibn Shatir, as a top example of them, the most brilliant and the most productive of them all, was a muwaqqit, literally a timekeeper at the Umayyad mosque, so he drew his salary right from the community, from the mosque, didn't need any Peter or Paul to support him. He did it all on himself. Nasiruddin al-Tusi, you're absolutely right. He was the director of the Maraga observatory, and by any definition, this is the largest observatory ever and the best equipped observatory built in the Islamic civilization, not only in terms of structures, but also in terms of the group of people that he brought together to form what I would call the highest research institute for planetary astronomy. Mu'ayyid al-Urdi was the engineer that Tusi brought him from Damascus. He obviously must have been an astronomer famous on his own in Damascus. I don't know who paid him in Damascus, but obviously he was not at an observatory or any of the sort, and he probably taught Euclid I mean, literally taught mathematics and geometry to do that. But he was brought to Maragha specifically because of his distinction as a planetary theorist, and hence to complement that. Qutbuddin al-Shirazi was a student of Nasiruddin and of Urdi, who came to Maragha to participate in all of these activities and to learn some more. He speaks very well of Urdi, despite the fact that he is officially the student of Nasiruddin. Shamsuddin al-Khafri comes from a small village in Iran called Khafr, near Shiraz, and we hear of his biography at the early period of the Abbasid, of the Safavid period, when Shah Ismail made it an order that every single Shiite should curse the first three caliphs. He went ahead and cursed the first three caliphs, but when he came back to Kirman, people told him, well, how could you do that? I mean, those are, the best caliphs we had. And he says, wait a minute, I need to do my astronomy, in effect. But then when the person who spoke about the Shiite law in Iran should have mentioned that in the anecdote, that this was the period also when Shiite fiqh scholars were brought from Lebanon to Iran.
Right.
And they had not yet established an independent Shiite juridical school. And it turns out that this same Shamsuddin al-Khafri was issuing Shiite fatwas when people asked him for this. So when the Karakis from Jabal Amil came to, and the Hurr al-Amili came to Iran, he asked them who was adjudicating in my absence before I arrived, and they said, this Shamsuddin al-Khafri. He was the one who was given. He said, what kind of fatwas he issued? He rendered, he said, he's good, stay with him. So all of those guys were basically from the belly of that society. None of them is distinguished by any, by any affiliations or a school. But we also know that in Iran, during this period, there is a tradition of studying these texts in the Hawzayah. And they become part of the official educational system, but they continue to write in Arabic all the way up to the 20th century. So that's as much as I know about them.
There's this remarkable concentration of people in Khorasan, in Tus and Sabzwar, and then, I'm sorry, then the other part of my question is really, what about the Samarkand Observatory?
Yeah, well, I jumped over the Samarkand. I only picked one character from the Samarkand who was a student of Ulugh Beg, and that is Alauddin al-Qushju, who comes up to Istanbul later on.
Goes to Istanbul.
And of course he writes the famous treatise, the Fathiyya for Muhammad al-Fatih, But this one was a student of Ulugh Beg. And while I have you on, and I think I am on camera, this is the only politician and the only potentate that I know of who was conversant enough to understand planetary astronomy, and that is Ulugh Beg.
Right.
The famous Ulugh Beg.
I visited the observatory there.
Yeah, and this Qushju says that when he was young, he studied astronomy with his master, Ulugh Beg himself.
Yeah.
So you have a potentate. Give me one politician nowadays who knows anything about planetary astronomy, I'll be very happy.
Okay, first Hussein,
Thank you.
and then in the back, and then Nelly.
My question is for Professor Matar.
Use the
You need a microphone.
My question is for Professor Matar, and I am sure to inform you that we don't have in Turkish a word for empire as well. Despite the fact that the word very empire made way into Ottoman Turkish, especially when an author in geographical literature, for example, or historical literature talks about European political entities, when there's an empire, they usually use that very word without translating it. However, increasingly from mid-16th century onwards, and the earliest reference I could find is in Celalzadeh, who was chancellor during the reign of Suleiman, the lawgiver, the word mamalik has been used, and that also made its way into official documents, and it was consciously used with the knowledge of corresponding similar entities in the European case to distinguish the Ottomans from lesser less important or less powerful political entities. So I just wonder what's your thoughts on the term Mamalik as a possible equivalent of empire if we problematize that very concept, and whether that Mamalik is used in Arabic sources as well.
That's a good question. I mean, Mamalik appears in Moroccan writings because obviously only Morocco was an independent, autonomous country with its own kind of policies and its own armies. So clearly you're not going to find it in any of the other regencies which were under the Ottomans. So anyway, the population there is within Ottoman control. But the Moroccan material, yes, the term Mamalik does appear in Mamalik al-Maghribiya, the Moroccan kind of properties or kingdom. The word king, Malik, is not a very favorable word. So actually it's again in the Moroccan correspondence, it's a form in which you can insult somebody. They have al-Malik. So, they would not use it if they wanted to praise it. But Mamalik does appear as possessions. And that's there. There is a conscience of that. But again, because the Moroccans had their own quote-unquote imperial ventures. Mulay Ahmad al-Mansour, conquered sub-Saharan Chad and Niger. He had ambitions to conquer even, South America. A century later, with Mulay Ismail, the idea of kind of reconquering Al-Andalus, that was a dream that was always there. So it is there, but it's only within Morocco, because that's the only country which had its own political military institution. So that's what I would find.
But I'd add that the Timurids did have a word for imperialism, a Arabic, Persian, Turkish word, Moshgilik. The act of kingdom seizing. And Babur in his memoirs says one time about one of his cousins, that his cousin who had fallen in love with this girl in Samarkand and wasn't active in military affairs, he said his poor cousin lacked most Gierlich ambitions.
I have a question for Dr. Saliba. Saliba, I am sorry.
I know it's difficult to have long E's in America, but it's good. Try. Only the Italians have. Where did you come? I don't understand.
My name is Serdar Doğan. My question is, in your presentation, you defined mathematics as a language. I'm curious if current scientific perspective accepts your definition or not. And if it does, how does it deal with the question of a hierarchy between different languages in terms of making claims concerning the nature of reality, including the religious language or religious literature, I would say?
No, I based the judgment on the use of language by Khafri on the fact that when he finishes describing one mathematical construction and he is satisfied with it and it meets the requirements, meaning the construction tells you exactly where the planet will be and correctly, so he says, وَوَجْهٌ آخر, and there is another one. And then he goes and finishes number 2, and then وَهُنَاكَ وَجْهٌ آخر, and then he goes on. Meaning, he was quite aware that this is just one way of doing things, you see? And hence, this manipulation of mathematics, and you saw, this mathematics is not trivial at all. This is a guy who had the facility and the ease to do it. And as such, he was also arguing against earlier people like Qutb al-Shirazi, who also claims in a book that he calls فَعَلْتُ فَلَا تَلُمْ, literally says, I had to spit it out. It was just irritating me. And then he complains about people who could not understand his mathematics. He said, I have described 9 ways of how the planet Mercury moves. 7 of them are wrong. 2 of them are correct. But I will not tell you which one so that I can test you to see your intelligence as well. You understand? So Khafri says there is no correct one.
Okay,
mathematics does not produce that for us. There are multiple ways of connecting those vectors, and you will always end up in the same spot, and that's why he gives it one wajh after another.
Okay,
he is not related to the religious material. He does not speak of it in any other language except that I just described now.
But your definition seems to be trapped in an infinite regression if we use mathematics as the only language to understand nature of reality. So, because you say 7 of the theories formulated were wrong, and he was satisfied with the last 2, and we cannot even rely on them in terms of their accuracy. And
I don't think I understood.
maybe I misunderstood. Yeah.
Before we get too deeply involved in an argument like this, we go to Nelly Hanna and then down here.
I was wondering if someone like Copernicus could look at a graph like the one we saw on the map you showed us and understand what it was about without a text. Could he just look at it and say, yes, this is such and such and such and such and such? Or are you hinting, even if you don't have the material proof, that these texts were actually translated into Arabic at one point? I have a comment for...
You mean into Latin, I hope.
From Arabic, yeah, I suppose into Latin. Or maybe we don't have the, the translations. But so I'm just asking, is it possible to look at these things and understand what's going on just by? I mean, we didn't understand, but would Copernicus understand?
Very good. You see, but it's just because we are Arabs, it doesn't mean that we understand all Arabic. So let us. And again, this is technical Arabic. And a good astronomer actually, even a modern Arab, I give this text to any modern Arabic speaker, especially literary people and all that. And I don't think it's in the same way, by the way. I can give a text on topology to a normal American speaker, and they will understand nothing if they are not trained in mathematics. So this is something else. But I should tip my hat here to say that it is a credit to the intelligence of Copernicus that he could actually make it out of these things. But two, although I don't have the testimony that he had somebody helping him, because none of those texts, by the way, that I showed you are translated into Latin. So it's obviously there is a new conception of what does it mean for ideas to be transmitted without having the original Arabic, the next Latin translated, meaning there are means of transmitting that are not necessarily translation. Now, in this instance, I don't know exactly who was helping Copernicus, but we know his contemporary, the man, the famous doctor, Vesalius himself, when he finishes the Fabrica of explaining how the human body is constructed, at the end of book 1, he wants to give us the names of every single bone that he had described in the first chapter as an index at the very end. And he says, in this one, I want to give the names in Greek, I want to give them in Latin, and I want to give them in Hebrew, and I want to give them in Arabic, which I do not know, but through the help of my dear distinguished friend, the physician Lazarus, the Jew, who helped me, who understands Hebrew and Arabic and brought it to me, and he lists them all in. So in other words, we have a confession of Vesalius himself saying, Mr. Lazarus is sitting right next to him, and he is helping him going word for word and transmitting it into the, and it is, by the way, in this, in both of his publications, the 1547 one, 1545, and the 1555. So, and this is a contemporary of Copernicus. Copernicus died 1543. So this kind of tool was available to those people. Let's not forget, by the way, despite what Amin Malouf writes about Leo Africanus, Leo Africanus was lecturing in Arabic at Bologna in 1536. So there were enough people in Italy who were doing this thing. And let's not forget that Copernicus got his degree from Italy. He didn't get it from north of the Alps. He got it from Italy. And that's where you find a lot of people who could have helped him at that time. Nabil, I'm absolutely certain, will dig them one after the other if he ever looks before the 1550s.
I had a comment for Nabil too. I mean, I was very interested in what you said you started with about Ahl Zimma, because it confirms the discussion we had in the morning. The limited use, I mean, the fact that the Zimma legal concept is of limited use, and that it does not really describe what was really going on. And I think what you said confirmed this. The only thing I wanted to add was that your comments on this cultural identity, I don't think they're limited to Syrian Christians. I think they are much more general than that. We find this a lot. The kind of vocabulary you used is quite common in Egypt too, and it's not limited to any particular religion. Awlad al-Arab, for example, is commonly used. This feeling of identity we have in poetry. There's one Sheikh Azhar of the 18th century who travels not very far, and then he writes tear. I mean, you cry when you read it. Poem about how homesick he is for his beloved country. And so this idea of being tied and of cultural identity in the 18th century, I'm talking about, I think was much more generalized than minority communities.
Yes, I mean, in the context I'm looking at this material, actually, the references are نحن الأرثوذكسيون بنو العرب. So they add the religious title as well. And really, I mean, in the cases that I've been looking at, it's not just using the term, because sometimes they use the term Arban, and that's a very negative term.
That's different.
No, and they don't like Arban. And, but the Quran doesn't like Arban either. So
Yeah,
I mean,
but that's
very consistent. But they will use it in the context of Orthodoxy, and that's what caught my eye. That basically, using Arab is fine, as you correctly point out, it's there. But now associating it with a religious denomination is new. And the only way I mean, that was a question I still want to ask the same later, is what's going on? I mean, these people don't know Ottoman at all. They don't know Turkish at all. Nobody's writing in Turkish. And they're still writing in Syriac, they're writing in Kashuni. What's going on? But they're writing very affirmatively in Arabic. They're translating Greek into Arabic, Latin into Arabic. They're very earnest about that project because they see their communities, and these are religious communities, within Arabic. But I agree with your point on a general.
My point actually is, and again I will start from Tahrir Square in Egypt, and for Jamil for the next couple of days. The use of humor through the years, and I will pick on Mullah Nasruddin, rahmatullah alayh, because he was Juha for the Arabs, but not so for non-Arabs, Mullah Nasruddin. And I think the use of the humor within the Muslim tradition, and I was fascinated by the way that you've brought Hayyu ibn Yaqzan, and connecting with the without outside the box, so to speak, for Americans who are not necessarily Muslims or from a Middle Eastern background, who loved the idea and who connected with it, whether there will be, and particularly for the next couple of days, opening up and the use of the humor. But I leave it for the panel to connect on it if you have come across that, or if you are going to take that next couple of days.
Okay. Just a point I forgot that Hayyu ibn Yaqzan also attracts American cotton maker in Boston at the beginning of the 18th century. So I mean, it makes its way even here. But that's an interesting point. I don't know about you.
So very quickly, Giancarlo is wanting to make an intervention, and then Professor Saliba has a question for Nabil, and then we would like to turn it over to Jamil for some announcements.
I was just going to add to this conversation about the Orthodoxy and Arabs, is it's also really right around the turn of the 18th century where there's this, I mean, this is connected with this morning's discussion about the millets. There's this Orthodox millet that's kind of forming in Istanbul, and there's a kind of a movement in the Levant against that. And part of the way that gets expressed is by saying we're Arab Orthodox as opposed to Rum Orthodox. And so there's also kind of a political context within the Christians of the empire in which this is one way it gets expressed.
Absolutely. Actually, after 1724, when you have Orthodox community converting to Catholicism, it's interesting that the Arab Orthodox, the Arab Orthodox, start calling them Ifranish, although they're kind of next door neighbors. But immediately they shifted somewhere. So that's very true. Good point.
Okay.
Yeah, just one question about this Père Francis ibn Turjuman. Is the Turjuman the same Boutros Dib who was the translator for Louis XIV?
I don't know. I mean, there was no mention anything other than that.
Yeah.
So I'm not.
I ask because there is a manuscript still at the Bibliothèque Nationale up till now, which is on also Islamic timekeeping for prayers. That was owned and given to the Royal Library by this Boutros Dib Turjuman, Boutros Dib al-Halabi Turjuman al-Sultan, meaning Louis XIV at the time. Gives the date. So if you want, I can send you the picture of
Yeah,
the
no, I
front.
appreciate it. I'd like to receive it.
See, I help him.
Thank you very much to the panelists and also to the audience.